Welcome to the first episode of Paranormal AF, the podcast where we spill the tea on all things paranormal. I'm your host, Rin. In this first episode, I'll be introducing myself just a little bit, and then we will discuss Moundsville Penitentiary and the visit I took there back in 2018. Since this is the very first episode of Paranormal AF, let me tell you just the tiniest bit about myself so that you understand why I'm so into the paranormal and the lens that I look at the paranormal through. I'm going to get through this as quick as I can because I don't want to take up too much time introducing myself. You're here for the spooky stuff. I have had an interest in the paranormal since I was very small, and that's because the paranormal was part of my life from a very young age, which we will cover in future episodes. After I graduated from college with the bachelor's degree in psych, I started actively ghost hunting with a group of friends, again something I'm sure we'll cover at a later date. While many will take digs at it, saying that behavioral science is a soft science, it is a science nonetheless, and I did focus a lot on research methods, behavioral statistics, abnormal psych, and cognitive psych while getting my degree. At a very young age, it became evident that I could see and communicate with dead people. I do not consider myself to be a psychic. When I have to use a label, I prefer to label myself as a spirit medium. And when it comes to the paranormal, I always try to find a balance between science, the experiential, and belief. I'm also a practicing pagan for over 2 decades, which shapes how I view both this world and the otherworldly. I believe that what we label as paranormal falls into one of 2 camps, as a general rule. The first being things that actually have a mundane cause or explanation. The second being things that science hasn't necessarily been able to quantify or quantify completely, but I do believe that someday that will change. I'm fond of saying that yesterday's magic is today's science and today's magic is tomorrow's science. All the things that we accept as science fact today were at one point in history unprovable. I believe that as time goes on, science will be able to explain, quantify, and prove the existence of things that we consider paranormal today. While I absolutely believe in the paranormal, I don't believe that everything that gets labeled paranormal actually is, and I do try to look for mundane explanations for things. After college, I did work in mental behavioral health, both outpatient and inpatient, but eventually, due to my health, I became unable to continue in that line of work. Today, I'm a podcaster, obviously. This is actually my second podcast. Spirit Tarot was my first, which some of you may have listened to when I was doing that one. And I do tarot and other types of readings along with spiritual life coaching and Usui Reiki. In this podcast, we are going to discuss a wide range of paranormal topics. We'll talk hauntings, cryptids, urban legends, psychic phenomena, UFOs, mysteries that have a paranormal bent to them, and anything else that we find going bump in the night. That is enough about me for today. Let's dive into our first topic. I titled this episode Moundsville Penitentiary because that is the name most people know the facility by. The actual name of the facility is West Virginia State Penitentiary, which is located in Moundsville, West Virginia. This facility is no longer a functioning prison, but it is known as one of the biggest paranormal hotspots in the U.S. This place was on my bucket list, and while I never did get to go for one of the nighttime paranormal investigation tours, I did get to do a day tour back in 2018 before we moved to the West Coast, and I'm so glad that I did. Let's start off with some history of the penitentiary and some of the types of paranormal activity that get reported the most. Then we'll talk about the tour I took and what I felt and experienced while I was there. I want to let you know up front, the history of this place is extremely dark. We will be mentioning things like murder, capital punishment, physical violence, sexual assault, torture, and suicide. While I do have to mention these things in order to accurately tell the story, I try to only discuss as much detail as I feel is needed to relay the story to you. but there's going to be a couple of gory bits, just an FYI. I will try not to be too descriptive. Forgive me, please, but even though I know the proper name is West Virginia State Penitentiary, that's kind of a mouthful. And I had always known the facility as Moundsville. That's what everyone I knew called it by, and it's just so ingrained in me that I'm likely to just refer to it as Moundsville here and there throughout the episode. That is just what we called it. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and that's just what everybody knew it by. I know for certain that I'm not the only one who tends to call it by the wrong name, because they actually have their website for the historic site programmed in their SEO to come up when you type in Moundsville Penitentiary into Google. And they even have a little remark on their website about how the decommissioned prison is often called by the incorrect name of Moundsville Penitentiary. Normally, I'd be all about being proper and calling the place by its proper actual name. But being from Western Pennsylvania, I can tell you that if you say West Virginia State Penitentiary to someone, you'll get a blank stare. But if you say Moundsville, they know exactly what you're talking about. Just know that I'm likely going to call it Moundsville here and there many times throughout this episode, because it's what's natural for me, and honestly because I feel like more people will know what I'm talking about if I use the wrong name. The West Virginia State Penitentiary's construction began in 1866. This stone Gothic structure was built, at least the initial part, by hand and not by just any old hands. It was built, at least in part, by the inmates. It functioned, to many surprise, as a prison up until 1995, at which point it stopped being used as a prison and became a historic landmark. The plot of land that would become the site of the West Virginia State Penitentiary was purchased by West Virginia on February 7th, 1866 for just $3,000. From 1866 to 1876, inmates worked to build the sections around the North Wagon Gate. These areas included the North and South cell blocks, the administration building, and a home for the warden and his family. The prison then officially opened in 1876 and housed 251 inmates at the time. Originally, the various counties in West Virginia were in charge of the prison, and then the state took charge of the facility in 1899. This was also the year of the first execution by hanging at the prison. On October 10th, 1899, Shep Caldwell was hanged for murdering his mistress in a fit of rage after seeing her with, the audacity, another boyfriend. Between the years of 1899 and 1949, there would be a total of 85 executions by hanging. Between 1951 and 1959, 9 inmates were executed by electrocution in the prison's famous electric chair known as Old Sparky, which was also built by an inmate. When I toured Moundsville, our tour guide was a former guard at the prison. He told us the story of how the inmate, Paul Glenn, the one who built Old Sparky, had to be put in sort of protective custody and eventually moved to another prison altogether because of the animosity the other inmates had towards him for building Old Sparky. In total, 94 inmates were executed at the prison during its operation. You may wonder why the execution stopped in 59, seeing as the prison seemed pretty execution happy. 94 execution in 60 years sounds like a lot to me. The state of West Virginia abolished capital punishment in 1965, and while I don't know for certain, I'd imagine that in the time period between 59 and 65, executions were probably put on hold until the final decision to abolish capital punishment in West Virginia was made. Now, while 94 executions over 60 years feels like a lot to me, that averages out to about 1.6 inmates per year being executed. Currently, in the United States, we average about 46 executions per year, while only some states still allow capital punishment today, just for the sake of putting things into perspective. That's just under one execution per state per year. So if West Virginia was executing 1.6 inmates per year, given that the public opinion of capital punishment was much more in favor of it during the years that Moundsville conducted executions, when you put it in this perspective of what their rate of execution was, the historical attitudes, and the current statistics of how many inmates are executed a year in the United States, it doesn't look like they were really that overzealous with executions, at least not as overzealous as I feel like their numbers sound. Whether they were over, under, or equal to the rate of executions in other states at that time, that's still 94 souls who died in, shall we say, unpleasant ways on those prison grounds. This next tidbit is going to be graphic, so if you don't like gory details, or if you're at work or around someone who shouldn't be hearing gory details, you'll want to skip ahead a few seconds. Both hanging and the electric chair are not painless, easy ways to go, and both can have their mishaps. It's said that when Frank Heyer was hanged on June 19th, 1931, due to his weight, his manner of death was not actually hanging, but his head popping clean off of his body. In case you're wondering, his crime that got him sentenced to death was murdering his wife. He was one of 14 inmates at the prison executed for that specific crime. Just like modern-day American prisons, overcrowding became a big problem by 1929, and as a result, between then and 1959, they actually expanded the prison to double it in size. And it is in 1959 when historians consider the construction of the prison to actually be completed. The prison was only built to house about 650 to 1,000 inmates, depending on what source you check. And that's a big difference, but I have found both numbers. The thing is, several times throughout its history, it found itself housing closer to 2,000 inmates, sometimes even over that number. Studies have taught us that no matter the situation, overcrowding causes social problems and behavioral issues. One of those notable behavioral issues is that when a space is overcrowded or overpopulated, we see a marked increase in violent behavior. This really made Moundsville a powder keg. You already have a population of violent offenders, and now you've got them in such an overcrowded environment that trouble was bound to ensue, and ensue it did. In addition to the 94 executions, there were 998 documented deaths within the prison between 1923 and 1995. That leaves 47 years of the prison's history where they weren't recording the deaths. And it's said that in the early days, it wasn't uncommon for 2 prisoners a month to die there, especially given the horrific torture that went on during the prison's history. That means there could be around 1,128 undocumented deaths from between 1876 and 1923. Do not quote that number, please, as that is not an official number. I'm just doing the math based on the facts we have. A possible 2 prisoner deaths per month for 47 years means that it is likely just as many, if not more, inmates died during that first 47 years as did during the years records of deaths were being kept. Any way that you slice it, this piece of land has seen a massive amount of death on it. Let's talk about some of the torture that went on in the early years of the prison. Again, if you are at work or there are younglings about, you'll want to put in earbuds or wait until the coast is clear, because throughout the rest of the episode will be sprinkled those sensitive topics that I mentioned earlier. The kicking Jenny is a method of torture invented within the prison walls. This torture was often carried out by Superintendent John E. Peck, but other prison employees also did this. I'm going to quote an article from the Cincinnati Enquirer, November 30th, 1886. I found this article on the Ohio County Public Library's website. The passage describes the kicking Jenny thusly. It is an instrument invented and built in the prison. It is made somewhat in the shape of a quarter circle, with the highest end about 3 or 4 feet above the platform upon which it is set. The prisoner is stripped naked and bent over upon the machine. His feet are fastened to the floor with ropes, while his hands, which are stretched over the upper end, are tied with rope attached to small blocks, by which a tension so strong that the frame of the prisoner can almost be torn in two can be made with a slight pull. After the prisoner is placed in position, the superintendent, or whoever does the whipping, takes a heavy whip made of sole leather, 2 pieces of which, about 3 feet long, are sewed together and the ends scraped slightly rounding, the lash being 3 inches broad at the handle, tapering to a point. With the whip, the prisoner is beaten until he is almost dead, or the strength of the man who is doing the whipping gives out. I have seen men whipped until they were covered with great purple and red welts from their hips to their shoulders. The lash would make a long welt across the body, and perhaps the next blow would fall across the others, when the blood would let out of the wounds, and the victim's back would be one mass of blood, torn and lacerated skin and flesh. The tour guide, when we went, said that the lash was sometimes dipped in vinegar and salt before the lashings. This article goes on to list some of the names of those tortured in this manner and who died from being tortured in this manner, as well as some other forms of torture used in the early years of the penitentiary. But I think what we've already covered gives you a picture of how awful a start the West Virginia State Penitentiary got off to. Torture and murders weren't the only violence at the prison. There was a lot of general but brutal physical violence as well as sexual assaults known to have happened at the penitentiary. Over the years, there were also several violent riots where hostages were taken, and it was not uncommon for inmates to set fire to or flood parts of the prison. The conditions at the prison were abysmal, to put it mildly. In the summer months, the prison was hot. I've seen reports that the upper cells could reach around 120 degrees during the hottest parts of the year. This unbearable heat would have been made even worse when, at its most overcrowded, it was housing 3 men per 5x7 cell. In the winter, there was often no heat, and broken windows made the cold even worse by allowing the frigid winter air in to make things even more miserable. On top of this, the prison was infested with rats, cockroaches, and lice. When the prison was designed, it was designed to house 1 inmate per 5x7 cell, and the cells were intended for sleeping only. However, in function, they wound up housing up to 3 men at a time, and inmates would be kept in their cells for extended periods of time. The worst offenders were not uncommonly kept in these cells for 22 hours a day during periods of the prison's history. The conditions for inmates and guards alike were obviously appalling, but it wasn't until March 7, 1995 that the prison was finally closed by court order. The court cited that the cells were too small and the conditions were inhumane, and that this facility constituted cruel and unusual punishment. the West Virginia State Penitentiary has been used for several movies and TV shows. In 1955, The Night of the Hunter was filmed there, and the movie was inspired by the story of one of the inmates. In 1971, Fool's Parade was filmed at the prison. In 2000, MTV's Fear filmed an episode there. In 2013, parts of Out of the Furnace were filmed there. And most recently, scenes from Netflix's Mindhunter were filmed at the prison, as well as some scenes from Hulu and Stephen King's Castle Rock. Before we get into the spooky stuff, there's a random factoid that I want to mention about the prison just because it fascinates me. Kathleen Maddox was an inmate at Moundsville. She had been arrested for a sloppy robbery of a gas station that involved the use of a ketchup bottle as part of the stick-up. Kathleen had given birth years earlier, at the age of 15, to a baby boy who would grow up to be rather infamous. In 1983, Charles Manson writes a letter requesting to be transferred to the West Virginia State Penitentiary to be near his mother, Kathleen Maddox. Given some of the things that he's said about his dear mother over the years, I don't think he was looking for a happy family reunion. And if you followed the Manson case at all, then you already know that this request was flat out denied. While this doesn't really have anything to do with our topic of paranormal happenings at Moundsville, I just really wanted to throw this tidbit into the episode because I just find it fascinating that there is a single degree of separation between this prison and Charles Manson. So thank you for humoring me on that little tidbit. Let's start getting into the spooky stuff now. We've already covered that the prison grounds themselves were the site of many documented deaths, more undocumented deaths, torture, sexual assaults, as well as a lot of physical violence, which is all ripe material for creating hauntings and imprints. During its operation, this prison was on the U.S. Department of Justice's 10 most violent prisons in America list. Not surprisingly, there were many suicides of inmates reported as well in this prison. Add to all of this that there are many who say that among the inmates, there was a common belief that the soul of anyone who died at the prison would forever remain there. One staff member referred to it as afterlife without parole. One more thing before we fully dive into the spooky stuff, I feel that I should mention what is directly across the street from the prison. The Grave Creek Mound, this is an indigenous burial mound. In fact, the reason the town of Moundsville is named Moundsville is because of the Grave Creek Mound. This burial mound was built by the Adena during 250 to 150 BCE. It is 62 feet high and 240 feet in diameter and took 60,000 tons of dirt to build. It is one of the largest conical burial mounds in the United States. There is a museum there, and you can actually visit the burial mound. In 2018, when I went, I was using a wheeled walker to get around at the time, and after touring the prison, I was just not up for any more adventuring that day. We had intended to go back another day to visit the mound, but we just didn't get to do that before moving west. And I wish so much that we had gotten a chance to go back and see the mound, because chances are that I'm not likely to go back east even for a visit. I'm not going to weigh in on if this site so close to the penitentiary contributes to the energy and paranormal experiences at the West Virginia State Penitentiary. But I will tell you that when I drove past the burial mound, I really did feel a strong energy from it. For myself, it wasn't a negative feeling at all, but when you have such a site near what some call one of the most haunted sites in America, you have to ask how the two places influence or interact with each other. Are there lingering spirits at the burial mound? Or is the energy entirely due to the land being a sacred site? I can't say for sure. We only ever drove past the mound, but in those drives, I never felt a spirit reach out to me. It was just this strong energy coming from the site. As an aside, if you are disabled, touring the prison is challenging to impossible, depending on your mobility. I was only able to navigate it with the wheeled walker because my husband was there to help me. There were places where we had to completely fold up my walker and he had to help me through because the walker couldn't fit through some of the spaces. There is also no way to get in and out of certain parts of the prison without going up and down stairs. Just an FYI so that you can plan accordingly if you do intend to tour the facility. Those who work at the historic landmark and those who visit it both report frequent paranormal happenings and encounters. Encounters have been reported all throughout the prison, but some of the most notable areas are the psychiatric facilities, the North Cell Block where the most violent inmates were housed, the boiler room, and the sugar shack. Some of the most common types of paranormal activity reported are screams, footsteps, shadows, and cell doors slamming. When it comes to paranormal evidence, Moundsville is supposed to be an EVP gold mine. Some have reported being touched, being scratched, and even being spit on. The Sugar Shack is probably one of the most notoriously haunted parts of the prison. This is a rec area below the prison where inmates were allowed to just hang out. Sounds innocent enough, right? I mean, a rec room. This should have been where the inmates had some good times during their incarceration, right? Not so much. This was a maximum security prison full of violent inmates. And when they were in the Sugar Shack, they were completely unsupervised. I mean, what could go wrong putting a bunch of violent offenders into an underground room with no supervision? That's right. You heard me right. No guards ever watched over the inmates while they were in the Sugar Shack, which means that this is the area of the prison where many a sexual assault occurred as well as other violent incidents. When I toured Moundsville, unfortunately, the Sugar Shack was closed to the public, so I didn't get to tour it, and we didn't really get a satisfactory explanation as to why the Sugar Shack was off limits to the public. When my husband was a teen, he toured Moundsville, and he did get to go into the Sugar Shack back then, which would have been around the very end of the 90s, maybe very early 2000s. It was before he and I were together. He says what he remembers of it is, and I quote, "weird drawings all over the walls and a bad feeling." My husband is not a psychic or a medium, but the energies at Moundsville can be so overwhelming and so strong that even those who believe they have zero ability to sense such things will still sometimes report feeling certain things or experiencing things while at the prison. No one knows exactly what all went on inside the Sugar Shack, but given the nature of those involved and the bits we do know, we can deduce that a great deal of violent behavior was gotten away with within this rec room, away from the prying eyes of the guards. Many incidents of being touched and seeing shadows have been reported in the Sugar Shack, and it is also reported to be an EVP hotspot. Another underground spot at the prison is the boiler room, which doubled as the hole. Solitary confinement for prolonged periods of time we know to be inhumane. This was even more inhumane than the standard, if you can imagine. And it was for those inmates who did something so egregious that they had to be sent to the hole. We've already talked about the level of violence in Gen Pop and among the more violent prisoners in the North Cell Block. So I will let your imagination give you an idea of just how horrific the acts had to have been to get them sent to the hole. Today's solitary confinement, which tries to be somewhat more humane or somewhat less inhumane, is still inhumane. Imagine being locked in a small, dark, underground room by the boiler with this massive stone Gothic structure above you for these long extended periods of time without light, likely without food, probably long periods of time without water. Imagine the toll that had to have taken on the inmates that were put in the hole. Again, this area was also off limits when I toured, but I'd imagine much of the paranormal activity reported in this section of the prison is imprints from those who had been kept down there. There is one specific spirit reported to be attached to the boiler room, and that is inmate R.D. Wall. Wall was serving time for a rape conviction when, in 1929, he was stabbed to death by other inmates with shivs while on his way to work in the boiler room. It is believed that the other inmates killed him because they believed him to be a snitch, which was like the second worst thing you could be in that prison. This attack was particularly brutal, and you'll find some conflicting stories about it. According to the most official source I can find, he was stabbed, slashed, a couple of his fingers may or may not have been cut off, and he was nearly decapitated. There are rumors that say he was decapitated, and there are even some rumors out there that say he was completely dismembered, but these appear to be exaggerations of a murder that was already violent and brutal enough. It's said that the spirit of Wall haunts the boiler room and even the grounds outside of it. We don't know when exactly the idea of Moundsville being haunted came into being. I've read reports that the guards and inmates began reporting paranormal activity sometime around 1930. In fact, some believe that R.D. Wall was the first spirit reported to be seen there. Again, around 1930, a year after Wall's murder, it is said that the guards started to see his spirit, and they even would sound the alarm because at first they believed that an inmate was loose in the yard. Over time, it came to be believed by the guards that what they were really seeing was not a loose prisoner, but they were seeing the spirit or the ghost of R.D. Wall. By the time the prison closed in 1995, it was pretty widely believed by guards, inmates, and the community to be haunted. In fact, within a year of the prison closing, it opened its doors to the public with former guards giving tours, both historic and paranormal. The north cell block is believed to be haunted by another inmate, known as Red. His full name was William Red Snyder, and he was serving time for the murders of his father and the father of his younger sister's boyfriend. On November 15th, 1992, Red was coming out of his cell when his friend Rusty ran up to him and stabbed him 37 times with a metal shank he had fashioned out of a piece of his bed. Red's blood is said to have soaked the cell block floor inside and outside of his cell, which was cell number 20, the last cell in B block of the north cell block where the most violent inmates were housed. Red would pass away from asphyxiating on his own blood early the following morning on November 16th, 1992. If Rusty and Red were friends, you might wonder why he so savagely murdered Red. Red was the head of the Aryan Nation within the prison. The words Aryan Brotherhood remain scrawled on the wall of his cell to this day. While Red had earned the respect of many in the prison, he also was believed to have ordered and orchestrated the murders of several other inmates during his time at the prison. According to a former guard, Maggie Gray, another inmate named Elijah Sutton wanted to take over leadership of the Aryan Nation, and he ordered Rusty to kill Red. It is said by many that Red has not left his old cell. I believe this wholeheartedly. I have a picture of Red's cell from when I toured Moundsville. I stood right where he was attacked. So many people were killed in or died in that prison that I'd imagine it's harder to not stand where something horrific happened than to find yourself standing where something horrific happened. But standing there, I really felt the weight of that moment. In an energetic sense, I stood in the blood of a brutal murderer who was in turn brutally murdered. Red Cell is often one of the spots paranormal investigators will spend some time in. There are those who say they easily get EVPs in his cell, while others say that he doesn't seem to want to chat with them, and their equipment that they bring into the cell will often have malfunctions. There are also reports of the light in his cell coming on when it shouldn't. We went for a day tour, as I said, and as our luck would have it, there was a school field trip there that day. I took a DSLR camera and had hoped to use my phone for some EVPs, but the group was too large and sometimes too noisy to attempt any EVP work during my trip. From a medium's perspective, though, I felt like Red was in that cell, staring at us. We were allowed to go into the cell, but I got the very strong sensation that he didn't want us to enter. While I was allowed to go in the cell, I opted not to go in that specific cell. The place altogether has a creepy vibe to it, and we have to take into account the effect that has on our psychology when we visit it. But to me, that cell felt different than all of the other cells I saw that day. I still get an anxious knot in my stomach when I think about standing in front of that cell, or I look at the picture of that cell. And there's nothing anomalous in the picture that I have that I took. But when I look at it, I do get this sick feeling, this anxious feeling. The other cells feel cold and mostly empty to me. But that one feels full. That's the best way I can describe it. I felt like there wasn't room for any of us in the cell. It's the best way I can put it. For some reason, that cell is different, at least to me, than every other cell I saw that day. My visit to Moundsville was on October 16th, 2018. My husband and I got the kiddos off to school and then crossed the state line, making the hour drive from where we lived in Pennsylvania at the time to Moundsville, West Virginia. While I really wanted to do a night tour, we didn't have anyone who could watch the boys for us at night to make a night tour possible. But Moundsville was on my to-do list for a long time. And my husband and I figured going for a daytime tour was better than nothing. And paranormal activity isn't limited to just nighttime. But we knew eventually we'd move away from the area. And he knew how much I wanted to go there. So we figured a daytime historical tour was better than nothing. When we got there, we found that a school was having a field trip there. And rather than having a tour guide dedicated just for the high school kids to do their own separate tour, everyone was put in a tour group together. We could have waited around for another tour, but we had to be back home in time to get the kids from school. We decided that waiting for another tour might make timing too tight, and there was no guarantee that the next tour group would be any smaller, honestly. The large group meant that EVP work was completely off the table for me, but I still had my camera, And my goal at that time, when I went to Moundsville, when I went to the West Virginia State Penitentiary, was I was just going for my own personal experience. I wasn't going with the intention of it becoming the subject of a podcast episode or anything like that. Had that been my intention at the time, there are some things I would have done a little differently and some other photos that I would have made a point of getting. But that wasn't my intention at the time. This was really just for me so that I could experience being there. As I said, my husband had already been there when he was younger, and he really wasn't that keen on going back. Our guide was a former guard there, as I mentioned earlier, and he was very knowledgeable about the prison's history. He even corrected some of the long-time misinformation that a lot of people have heard over the years about the prison. He told us stories about his time there as a guard, but he also told us that he was leaving some things out of this particular tour because there were a couple of small kids in the group. I am not by any means throwing shade at these parents. They were bringing their kids on what was billed as a historical tour, and if you're not into the paranormal or a history buff, then you wouldn't know that this place is haunted as fuck, and you might not know how gruesome its history is. My husband and I already knew a fair bit about Moundsville, and while our kids really wanted to go check out the spooky castle prison, we felt they were a little too young yet at the time for even the historic tour. So again, no shade to these parents. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they didn't realize what exactly they were going to be touring with their kids. And to be fair, the prison doesn't list a minimum age for the historic tours or give any warnings that parents shouldn't bring small children along on the historic tours. At least they didn't at the time I was there. These people could have just been passing through and went, "Hey, that is a really interesting castle-looking building that offers historical tours. Let's go kill some time." And our guide did a great job of trying to give us as much info as possible without saying anything in earshot of the little bits that might scar them for life. But I will say that young children do tend to pick up on paranormal activity more than adults. And these kids were not digging the vibe at the prison. I don't think the children were in any danger though, so I just want to put anybody's fears to rest. The inmates at Moundsville were violent offenders, the worst of the worst that needed to be locked up in maximum security. They hated snitches, but they hated one thing even more: child molesters. There are certain social mores within prisons, even today. One of those is that everyone hates a child molester, and bad things tend to happen to them inside of prison. Moundsville had a particular reputation for the inmates making sure that such offenders would never be able to offend again. In fact, during one of the many riots, several of the inmates made at least one of the guards being held hostage watch as they carved up and cut the heart out of another inmate. That inmate's crime? I think you can guess what it was. I feel like in the afterlife without parole, the rule that you don't mess with kids is something that these inmates still enforce. I never got the sense of anything negative directed at the kids who were on the tour. I really felt like they were safe. They didn't dig the vibe, but I felt like nothing was going to happen to them. Just because the kids were there, though, doesn't mean that our tour was uneventful. You begin by taking a look at Old Sparky, which electrocuted 9 inmates. Their names are displayed right there by the chair. Standing near Old Sparky, I felt like I couldn't breathe, and there was this odd, disorienting sensation that other people in the group reported as well. In fact, I felt so strange and sort of disoriented that I kind of questioned if I was even going to be able to do the tour, because you see Old Sparky right at the beginning, like that. At least when we went, that was where you started your tour. And I felt so just off, and this weird sensation, and like you felt like you couldn't breathe and disoriented and dizzy and lightheaded, etc. And so it was really an interesting way to start the tour, because I was like, oh my gosh, is something wrong with me? But then I heard my husband saying that he felt odd too once we were looking at the chair, and other people reported feeling a little strange around the chair as well. As we moved out of that initial room and started walking a hallway, a former inmate tagged along with us. I guess I should make it clear that the inmate in question was in spirit form. Now, when you go to Gettysburg and many other reportedly haunted sites that you are able to tour, the ghosts a lot of times are from a time period long ago. That's not always the case at Moundsville, since the prison wasn't closed until 95 and deaths were occurring right up until then. Red, being one of the most noted ghosts at Moundsville, died in 1992, as we covered earlier. This means you can encounter the spirits of people who were serving time at and died at Moundsville during your lifetime, depending on your age. Our tour guide worked at the prison during its last 9 years of operation. The spirit that decided to tag along during the tour had been an inmate when our guide was a guard at the prison. He was actually relatively fond of our guide. Some of the inmates still hold grudges and don't like some of the former guards who have or do guide the tours of the facility. This spirit seemed okay with our guide, almost playfully heckling him from the other side as he led the tour through this hallway. I'd imagine he does this frequently, and that most times no one notices him. But when he realized I did, he found it extremely amusing. He was only with us for that little bit while we talked in that hallway. Now, of course, this bit is purely subjective, obviously. There's no equipment that I can or could have hooked up to myself in order to prove this interaction happened. This isn't evidence of anything. I'm simply relaying my personal experiences to you. One of the most notable things from our tour occurred in the cafeteria, kitchen, dining room area. Though I wouldn't know that it happened until we got home and I was going over the photos I had taken. Well, you won't hear about it in the paranormal shows that feature the prison. At least I didn't hear about this specific thing in any of those I've ever watched. There's been quite a bit of activity reported in this particular area of the prison. It isn't as talked about as the Sugar Shack or the Boiler Room, but apparently as far as experiences go, it's a pretty active area. In fact, staff report seeing a shadow man here quite frequently. They refer to him as one of the most active and noted and well-known spirits there. While we were milling about, I discovered that some of the high schoolers weren't really interested in the history. I know, shocker, right? But they were hoping to catch a ghost on camera. Me, being me, and doing what I've done and what I do, gave them some tips on how to improve their odds. Though these tips might not have done them a whole lot of good, since many people's cameras didn't seem to want to function properly in this area on and off. It was like an intermittent problem for a lot of people. I got a feeling about one part of this cafeteria, kitchen, dining room area. I didn't see anything. I just had a feeling. And my husband and I waited so that we were the last ones to go over and explore that part. Photography is also one of my hobbies, and I did take a photography class in college. I am not an expert, but I'm half decent. And one of the habits I have is that I will take multiple shots of the exact same thing. This is true whether I'm photographing my kids, my cat, nature, or trying to catch something paranormal. My husband and I were the only two people on this side of the room. We made a point of this. We are standing in the larger overall room, what would have probably been the dining area. And he is slightly behind me to my right, keeping watch to make sure there's no one around while I'm taking these shots. No way that anyone could be interfering or affecting the shots that I'm taking. I'm aiming the camera, which was a Nikon DSLR, into a room through a doorway that has an open door at the back of the room that leads into the circuit breakers. There is no electricity in this part of the prison while we are touring it. While there are circuit breakers there, like I said, again, there's no electricity, so there was no lighting. I do my usual thing where I snap a couple of shots and we move on. There was sunlight coming in through some windows, and that light was coming from behind us, which caused my shadow and my husband's shadow to be cast on the wall of the room that I was taking the photos of, but there was no ceiling internal lighting. In the photos, you can see our two shadows, and then, in one of them, a third shadow appears between us. Again, we were the only two people on that side of the room at the time, and given the layout of the room and where the windows were, etc., no one standing on the other side of the room should have cast a shadow to where I was photographing. Is it a trick of light? Did my husband fail at his job as lookout? Or did the shadow figure, often reported to be seen in this area, grace us with a photo op? The next stops were in the north cell block. We've already talked about red cell, but after you move on from that, there is an opportunity for those brave enough to voluntarily be locked into a cell. On my husband's first tour there, before we were together, he did this, and it is really that specific experience that has made him not very keen on being at Moundsville at all. He's not really comfortable there, and he will very emphatically describe to you why. But that's not my story to tell, so I'm just going to say that his experience in the cell was not a positive one, and that is why he is not keen on touring or investigating the facility. During our visit in 2018, he very adamantly stated that there was no amount of money or any other form of bribery that could get him to step into any of the cells, let alone be locked into one again. I, on the other hand, eagerly volunteered. When they do this, they tell anyone who wants to go ahead and step into a cell. The guide then goes into the guard room and flips the switch to lock the whole cell block. The sound is like nothing else, and is certainly a sound I don't think you can forget either. Hearing it on television even just doesn't compare to standing there, watching those bars slide in front of you and hearing that sound as they click into place and lock. It is an experience. Now, mind you, we've got the paranormal going on here, and then we've got this sound and these bars clicking into place. So there's psychology at play here too. Witnessing that, hearing that sound, that has an effect on you psychologically. I know I'm there as a volunteer. This is willful. I am not being kept here. I will be let out. And yet there is still this moment when those bars come closed and you hear the clunk of that lock, that there is a physical reaction within your body. And then you have the play on top of that this place is haunted AF. Well, my husband will never do it again as far as being locked into one of the cells. My experience was such that I absolutely would try it again, especially if I had the chance to stay longer and to try for some EVPs and more photos in the cell. Just in case you're curious, I chose to be locked into cell number 6. While I didn't have a negative experience in the cell, I did feel somewhat uncomfortable. I, at first, was laughing and joking about needing bailed out, and this isn't so bad, and making light of it. When then I felt a presence fade in behind my right shoulder, and that's the best way I can describe it. There was nothing there, and then I could feel as something slowly became present. This is the cell block where people have reported being touched and even spat upon. I didn't know it at the time, but women have also reported feeling their faces being caressed or fingers running through their hair in this part of the prison. The sensation that I felt when I was in the cell after the presence faded in was that something really wanted to reach out and touch me. That was the impression I got. And again, I did not know that women had reported these experiences in this area. Me, being me, again, obviously, I took my usual steps, and I made it very clear that I was not open to being touched in any way, and the presence did not actually touch me, but I could feel this sense of want, as if its energy was pressing against my energy. I had my phone with me in the cell, so I took a couple of selfies over my right shoulder to see if anything would show up, but they are just grainy photos of me in a dilapidated prison cell. They're really grainy because, again, no electricity, there's no light, so only what comes in through the windows, and that light doesn't filter very well into the cells, so photos on the dark side, very grainy because there's not enough light and that, but I don't see anything anomalous in the photo, but I can tell you that I could feel a presence in the photo, and it became, while I was in there, this sense of, you stay over in your part of the cell, I'll stay over here in my part of the cell, and we'll agree to stay in our respective corners of the cell until I get out of here. So I didn't have a sense of danger, or I didn't have a negative experience to the point that I would never do it again. But I definitely felt like once I was in there in the cell, it attracted something, alerted something, and it was there with me in the cell, wanting to get closer to me, wanting to interact with me. And it was definitely an uncomfortable feeling. I absolutely would do it again. 100% would do it again. I did feel something very uncomfortable within the cell. And I really believe that had I been able to investigate or use equipment, that likely there would have been some indication of that presence. It just wasn't something that could be picked up in a cell phone selfie. Keep in mind, as I've talked about all of this, that these are things that I saw, felt, and experienced during the day on a daytime historical tour. Much of what I have said about my personal experience, well, really all of what I've said of my personal experiences are subjective. I've given you the history and facts of the place, but my experiences there are subjective. They are not evidence of anything. They are simply my experiences. So keep that in mind. According to their website, the West Virginia State Penitentiary website that they have, they are still offering historical tours. They are also offering paranormal investigation tours. They're also offering that you can book private paranormal investigations. And just because it seems like an absolutely amazing idea, they also run a haunted house out of the prison during October. Yeah, that's right. Absolutely nothing could go wrong running a haunted house in a place that is haunted AF. I mean, come on. And, we actually had to stay out of one part of the prison. This is not something new. We actually had to stay out of one part of the prison during our tour because that's where they had all of the haunted house props, etc., which they apparently weren't running the haunted house the year that because we were there in October. but apparently there had been some sort of incident, and I don't remember now. Our guide made a brief comment about it. Something happened to a young lady, but I cannot for the life of me remember what it was, because this was several years ago now. But yeah, and there was an incident. But, if I'm being completely honest with y'all, I would probably be one of the people who would go to the haunted house in the haunted prison if given the opportunity. Because, why not tempt fate, I guess. Whatever. But if that's your thing, check it out. I am not 100% sure if they are doing it this year or not, but I do know it is listed on their website. So I don't know what the latest on that is. Let's wrap up with my closing thoughts on Moundsville. I 1000% believe this is a legitimate haunted site. I don't feel the staff is faking anything or making any of this up. I think that this site is truly haunted, and if you look at the numbers alone, 94 executions, 998 documented deaths, all of the undocumented deaths that we know happened, but we don't have the exact numbers for, the acts of violence and the suicides committed here. Honestly, how could this piece of land not be haunted? I mean, just in a matter of statistics, the statistical probability that much horrific, dark, awful, brutal stuff happened here, that all of these deaths happened on this piece of land, the statistical probability that there is nothing haunting this piece of land is it would defy odds. It would defy all odds if this piece of land wasn't haunted, because the statistical probability is that even if it's not as haunted as some people say, the statistical probability is in favor of it being haunted with all of the things that happened on this piece of land. The good news is that this is classified as a historic landmark, so it's not going to be torn down, at least not anytime soon. So we're not likely to see it turned into condos or homes or a strip mall where these hauntings would then affect residents or shoppers or shop owners. As a medium, I'm here to tell you that we can't always get all spirit activity to go away. Sometimes a lot of the times, the best we can hope for or the best we can do is to keep the activity at bay. But with Moundsville, there's so many spirits and there's so much energy that it's a force of the supernatural unto itself. Trying to clear it or even keep the paranormal at bay there would be like trying to keep a hurricane from making landfall. If you are interested in investigating the paranormal and you get the opportunity, this is definitely a place that I recommend investigating. I do recommend taking precautions and being careful, but this is definitely on my recommend list. I don't know that I'll ever make it back east, but if the opportunity ever arises for me to go back and do an investigation of the West Virginia State Penitentiary, I absolutely would do it. I hope that you've enjoyed the first episode of Paranormal AF. Thank you for listening. Please share the podcast with your friends, and I'll see you Paranormal AF spooky mother lovers in the next episode.